Thank you for joining, Ananya. Thanks so much for coming. We went to college together in Boston, and why don't you tell us what you do right
do
now?
I do?
Yeah.
Okay. I currently work in the capacity of an assistant director to the Harvard School of Public Health India Research Center. And as you can imagine, it's a public health center. So, from various research projects to training and capacity building initiatives to knowledge communication and translation activities that we undertake, both for public partners, government partners, as well as private partners or hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Public health is quite relevant right now, given the state of affairs we are in. Like we're in the middle of a pandemic, but I still feel that most people don't understand exactly what public health does. So, can you give an example of the type of projects that you do, or a project that you probably are doing right now?
Yeah. No, I think that's actually very true. That there was never a better time in the history of the world to understand what public health is.
Yes.
And I think as a public health practitioner, now, I think not very many people had even heard about the term public health until, thanks to the media and everything, people understand or realize that, okay, there is something abstract out there called public health. But I think a very simple way to understand public health is that, of course, it's about health. And then there's this clinical aspect of health that people understand that, okay, I'm sick, I have cough, fever, toothache, and I go to a doctor or a dentist and they treat me and I'm done. Public health just comes from a population perspective that yes, you are focusing on providing health, but it's from a population perspective. It's not like one doctor to one patient. It could be one public health practitioner to so many other people. A second difference is that a lot of clinical health is very, very tertiary in nature, giving you a medicine, giving you a surgery, or extracting a tooth. But public health would be more about prevention, health promotion. And then I think in clinical health, how people understand it is more to do with one doctor, one clinician, or one nurse. But public health is so much more than just a healthcare provider. It includes government systems, it includes CSR organizations, it includes a lot of NGOs, it just includes the way people behave and respond to information, and of course it includes the academia and researchers. So it's public health.
So it's a very broad area, and unlike clinical practice of health, which is mostly curative in nature, if you are working as a public health professional, no matter what your expertise is, you need to look at how population behaves, what are the factors that go into deciding the health outcomes, when people will fall sick and all those things. Is there an area that you focus on?
Yes. So currently I am focused on projects related to Poshan Abhiyan, which is related to nutrition. So there are two sides of the project that we are currently engaged with. One is focused on identifying the role of Anganwadi workers, which are these community health workers, mostly women working on the front lines, and their role in providing supplementary nutrition to communities, their role in changing behaviors, attitudes and norms within not just women in the families but men. How do they understand basics of, say, breastfeeding, complementary feeding? What do they know about anemia? And if they know something about anemia, how do they do anything about it? So really capturing these best practices from across the country, and of course this project is with the Ministry of Women and Child Development. So we'll look at all the states across the country and collate such best practices with an aim to really document them in a way that local knowledge, contextual knowledge can be documented using an evidence-based criteria and then given back to the communities for skilling it up. So that's one side of the project. The other side of the project is more research and data focused, and that's on really promoting the convergence between agriculture and nutrition. So when we talk about healthy eating, we have to go upstream and think about, okay, what food are we currently growing? What food is out there in the market? So a simple example is, rather a simple use case from the project would be, how could we promote, consumption of nutri-millets like ragi and jawar and bajra as opposed to refined grains. I remember that there was a time where butter naan was such a thing at hotels and through delivery platforms.
Yeah.
But I remember that when I went to a 5-star hotel in the pre-COVID lockdown era, I was like, do you have a bajra or a jawar roti?
Right.
And that was so much more expensive than
Absolutely.
a butter naan.
Yes.
So in some ways, world is realizing this.
Yes.
But this project is really focused on mapping the rich diversity of current and traditional crops that India has had, and how we can really, we don't have to wait for the West to realize that, for example, there is something called as flax seeds in India, in Hindi is called asli. So there were these asli ke laddus which were eaten, and now you see all these flaxseed supplements going down into smoothies
in fancy packets.
Exactly. So the idea of the project is really to use data to identify what are the crops that are specific and regional to a certain context, and then how do you make them fashionable, and then of course provide we are just providing the data side of it, but I'm sure the ministry and Poshan Abhiyan would look at all sorts of system thinking in terms of promoting crop diversification and then going up to dietary diversification.
So it's a very holistic project. It's interesting because it all ties up with the natural resources in terms of agricultural resources that we have available, and how we can harness that to actually improve our own nutrition, and we don't have to wait for any directives from the West or from any knowledge keeper, right? It is actually looking within that what resources we used to have, which we probably would have ignored in the last 40-50 years, and then probably get back to those. This is very interesting.
That's true. And an interesting part of the project is that it looks at both the supply side as well as the demand side. So when we look at supply side, okay, what is growing? But an equal part of the deal is to generate demand for dietary diversity. People should first of all know, unless there is, everything is so market driven that one has, it's a reality that unless you drive up consumer demand for healthier foods, there would be no economic incentives for a farmer to produce refined grain, to really switch back to these indigenous crops, as opposed to, refined grains which may have, higher support prices. So again, supply and demand have to be,
and I think it's a good start in a way that not just from, even if you look at purely from a health point of view, where our disease burden is headed. We just got a research a couple of weeks ago which said that white or like polished rice is directly related to the rise in diabetes in India. And all this happened at the time of Green Revolution, right? I'm not blaming Green Revolution for it, but as a side effect, what happened was that everybody started growing all these mainstream crops, hybrid crops, and we lost a lot of our indigenous crops, and with that we also lost all the nutritious value that they used to bring to the table. So this is quite interesting from that point of view.
I think it's a larger debate. I think not just in India but world over, and I would very, very explicitly say that consumer markets and corporations world over, I think sort of dictated the agenda for refined foods, which we now call junk foods.
Absolutely. Bread is all that, right? The bread and the buns that you need to make
all
burgers.
The burgers and the pizzas.
Pizza basis
of
is
course,
very refined grains.
We all love burgers and pizzas, but I know that the next time, now that I go to Modern Bazaar, I would rather, I've switched between ordering refined burgers on, say, Zomato and switch to multigrain buns,
Okay, that's a start.
And that's a start. And then, making your own vegetable patty and, knowing how much oil and how much refined grains are going down in your burger. So I think it's the way world was moving in the last, to a couple of decades. And then NCDs, obesity, as we say, diabesity, as a pandemic.
It's a bigger pandemic nobody talks about.
Exactly.
And it's going to be here for a while.
Exactly.
It's not going to go away.
And so the US has realized that, this entire move against trans fats, against refined grains, and of course, those fads come to us only once they've been in the offing in the US. So I think it's a larger realization that ultimately human race would think of ways in which they can protect their species. So I think now people are realizing where they're headed. When you think about India, And especially after my MPH at Harvard, or while at my MPH at Harvard, there's this perception that, India is all about infectious diseases, right? And diarrhea and malaria and tuberculosis, and probably that's the major ailments that we have. But as a student of public health, and while being a dental surgeon in my past life, I was really surprised to see that, and this was a couple of years back, that 60% of the disease burden in India is because of all these non-communicable diseases which we don't see.
Exactly.
Which how many people know that the biggest reason why Indians die is cardiovascular diseases, heart attacks,
all the samosas we're eating.
Yes, and so much of it has to do with what you eat and how much do you exercise, the amount of salt or sodium do you take. So I think that realization is coming through.
True.
But not very many people, because it's such a silent pandemic.
Exactly.
That all of these projects around nutrition, while it's equally important to look at acutely malnourished children, which of course cannot be discounted.
True.
India of course has a lot of children by virtue of its population, by virtue of all of these systemic factors. I think of course micronutrient deficiencies can't be ignored. True. But you cannot underestimate the importance of coarse grains, vegetables and fruits and natural foods in preventing diabetes and obesity, and especially when a lot of us are vegetarians.
True.
In vegetarian diets, they tend to be very, very carb heavy, right?
The two most diabetic states in India are Tamil Nadu and Gujarat, right? And Gujarat is largely vegetarian.
Yeah.
So they are at a special risk.
Yeah. And like with my dad, he's a diabetic. And initially I remember when I used to talk about brown bread, brown rice, multigrain roti, he would please, I remember I got him some digestive cookies or biscuits. And he's like, no, these are not tasty. Give me the other ones,
True.
So, but now, in his atta, when mummy, went on to include dal, chane ki dal, bajra.
Exactly.
And then he realized that this is not something new. This is not a fad.
We've always had it.
Yeah, this is probably going back to where we came from. So just getting used to those tastes.
True.
Just getting used to not a lot of refined grains. I think it's again comes back to behavior change. True. Which is takes time to come about, but is critical.
So you, as you just mentioned, you trained in the clinical side of medicine, right? You trained as a dentist. So, and now you work on I don't think you use your dentistry skills in the public health work at all. What was the trigger that made you switch to, or pursue public health in general, and sort of leave the clinical practice of dentistry?
Okay. I would say two things at different times of my lives, which one played subconsciously and the other one was more like a butterfly effect. So subconsciously, when I was growing up, I really didn't know what I wanted to become. For most part, I never knew what I wanted to become, or whether I wanted to be, become something. So, and I always thought that I'll do social work.
Right.
Somewhere I got this, term into my head. And I used to think I thought it was that easy to do social work. That you just decide that you're going to do social work and there'll be somebody sitting there, giving you some social work to do. Okay. So that's how I grew up, not quite knowing, what social work means. And then, and that there are so many ways to do it. I'm still wondering, how best to do social work. So in that sense, I think the earliest impact that I had on my subconscious was, when my mom and dad, since they were my dad is in public service, my mother at that time was into a lot of women collectives.
Right.
So I saw a lot of these Motiabind camps, and cataract Motiabind was a big deal, is still a big deal. And I saw, so these health camps made me realize that, okay, all of these doctors come in here and instead of treating one patient at a time, they're looking at so many people at the same time, and the impact value is so much higher. So I think from that perspective, growing up in UP in all sorts of cities that nobody would have heard about.
Right.
I think it gave me a sense that okay, this is the kind of need that exists, and a health professional at that time, I didn't even know who was a specialist or who wasn't.
Right.
So I think I was inclined towards biology as a subject, probably because I was not good at maths, and probably because biology was interesting. And then I got into the dental school, and it was in my final year. Again, not knowing whether I still want to be a dentist, but I started. So this was I started volunteering for 400 dentistry for autistic children.
Okay.
So now starts this butterfly effect.
Yeah.
Okay, and probably because that used to give me a sense of maybe trying to do something meaningful. I did not know how much of an impact it had.
Yeah.
But I thought, okay, this was more on the lines of the social work I always wanted to do. And then what happened, that there was this lone guy, this lone wolf, who was looking after all the volunteering services over there. And then I got to know that International Association of Dental Students was having this health volunteer trip or a camp in Sudan.
Oh, Africa.
So I literally looked up Google, and I was like, okay. And then and this was the time when there was a lot of civil war kind of situation. The Darfur crisis was ongoing. All of that was ongoing. So Sudan was in news.
True.
And they told me that Khartoum University is organizing, and it was called the International Kafla that year.
Right.
And they said, do you want, would you like to be a health volunteer? And I was like, okay. And then I was like, okay, I'm a dental surgeon. I'll see what I can do as a health volunteer. And then they said that, their dental university and health university sort of, adopt all of these villages.
Right.
And then go out to the field and provide them, with care. And so I remember telling my parents about it. I must have been, 20 at that time. And I called up my mom and dad, and they were super excited. And they never for once doubted. I'm sure this was my first international trip. I don't think I would have traveled outside of India.
Right.
And, my mom and dad were like, okay, Sudan as your first experience.
Yeah.
So I think, and I remember once my mom asked me that I hope you'll be safe and, you're going out for the first time. And I remember having told my mom that if I have to, have an injury or die, I don't have to wait for a gunshot. I might just slip in my washroom and, not survive.
It's more likely.
Yeah. So so I was like, so probabilities work like that. So I think that was it. And then once I reached there, and I made a lot of good friends over there, and I realized that, especially I think student community or medical or dental community in Africa, at least back then in 2010 and 11, I thought they were so much more geared towards volunteering.
Right. Yeah, that is something I had also noticed when
I'm sure, because I thought that such a perspective, at least back then in India, did not exist.
True.
And that's when I realized that all of these college students are attached to at least one or the other volunteering service, whether it's through their college, whether it's through UN. But people are so much more students are so much more publicly aware of their duties and the ways in which they can contribute. So I think that was a life changing moment for me, where I realized that okay, from a clinical setting inside a clinic, here stakes are different. Impact value is different. I was, for example, if I were doing an extraction, I would do extractions for say 20 people, 30 people in a day. Different people of different communities, different tribes. I'm not even probably able to interact with them.
So they had asked you to come to Sudan to volunteer because that facilities were not there, or that skill set wasn't there.
So there were these mobile dental clinics.
Right.
And of course, they would have had their mobile health clinics. I was part of the mobile dental clinic. And the areas that we were going to were near Port Sudan, and then a lot of these borders with Egypt.
Right.
So a lot of these communities where, of course, we were distributing a lot of toothbrushes, toothpaste, teaching them how to brush. But then a lot of them needed critical care. For example, if there's abscess, if there is pus, and you have say root stumps. I mean, now I'm going back to my clinical stuff.
Right.
But of course, if there is an acute pain, then of course you're looking at extractions or drilling cavities.
Right.
So there was a mobile dental clinic, and there were a lot of these TB of family planning clinics. So we would land in the middle of nowhere, set up, our clinics, and then people would go out in the communities and say that here we are from University of Khartoum, and of course they had partnered with their government that we are here to provide you care, and then there would be a long line of people coming up for the care. And I remember I don't even think they would have even recognized that I was not a Sudanese so which was all fine, because the only thing that we could, or the only common word between me and the communities was salam. That's something I knew.
I've also noticed that Africans are very welcoming of Indians.
Yes.
They like hanging out with us. They watch our TV shows.
They watch Bollywood all the time.
I was in Ghana, and all I could see on their TVs was they were watching all these K series TV shows. All of them. Kasauti Zindagi Ki and everything. It was so popular. I was like, wow.
Yeah, and I remember that on the last day of my trip, there was this ceremony, where all the professors were there, and they asked me to go to the dais and speak something. And I thought, I don't know, what am I expected to speak? Very academic, this, that. And then so I had a friend of mine, and she shouts from the from the hall, and she's like, can you sing a song from Kuch Kuch Hota Hai? And I was like, okay, that's a different spin to things. And I literally sang a song from Kuch Kuch Hota Hai. That is what they wanted to hear from me. But I think that trip or that experience was, I would say, it is a butterfly effect, but that made it very clear to me that public health is real, and public health is something that I want to do. And of course, as life would have it, once I started interning, there was a distraction, a UPSC distraction that came into my life.
You wanted to be a civil servant. Or you were wanting to be a civil servant?
I don't know if as much. I don't know if I wanted to be a civil servant.
Or were you doing it just because it was there?
Yeah, because I think I was, and I'm happy to say that I'm the last of that generation which grew up in this environment, that if you want to do some public service, then writing the UPSC is the epitome. I mean, of course, people knew there were other ways to make a difference. But, all parents would say, itna hi desh ke liye karna hai, UPSC likho. Go to Rajendra Nagar, go to Mukherjee Nagar. Okay? So I think, and thankfully, I was last of that generation, and I'm grateful to, how societies and communities have changed, and people realize there are more ways to make a difference, and for the pure reason that there are so many applicants in UPSC, and ultimately, UPSC has like a 0.01% probability of.
It's the most competitive.
It's the most competitive exam. So I think UPSC in that, and then my father is in the public service, so I think a lot of. I think I grew up in such an environment, so I thought, okay, social work. Probably this is how you do social work, right? So I again my life went in a different direction for 3 years. Me not realizing that my calling was right there back in 2011.
You had already seen it.
So again, I deviated and with a series of, I would say, unsuccessful attempts at UPSC. And then again, a butterfly effect came in and saved me. And so this was in 2014-15. That I was just talking to this friend of mine, like I'm talking to you. And I had given my prelims in UPSC, and for whoever has given UPSC, you can, in CSAT exam, you can literally, because the solutions are out after you give the prelims, so you can pretty much calculate whether you're getting through your prelims or not, right? Because coaching institutes, they have the question paper, it's all maths in English, and they know that, okay, these should be the right answers to your multiple choice questions, and then you bring back your question paper, so you can pretty much calculate if you're sailing through or not. And I remember that I was sailing way above the mark, and so all was going well for me in UPSC, and I was like, okay, this is it, probably this is the time that I'll get through UPSC. And then there was a break for a couple of days before I started my mains preparation. And I remember I was just talking to my friend, and I was telling him, and I was like, and this is in Rajendra Nagar. Okay, and he was also giving UPSC.
Okay.
And I was like, यार ये क्या हो गया है, चलो मैं UPSC में आ तो गई हूँ, but and I remember telling him, just FYI, I never wanted to do this, and I wanted to do public health, and I told him that, you know, I'll always have this regret that I wanted to really study and probably go to a very, very good academic institution.
Right.
And I remember mentioning him. I didn't mention Harvard. I said, you know, maybe Oxford, this and that. And I wonder what is it that these people study over there.
Right.
And मुझे हमेशा लगता है it's a regret. And I remember telling, मैंने कहा maybe अपने बच्चों को मैं जो हूँ, maybe that's when मेरा सपना पूरा होगा types. And then he was like कि नहीं, but why wait for your kids?
Right.
You could do that.
Exactly.
And I was like नहीं, अब कहाँ, अब तो मैंने छोड़ दिया. And I always had that feeling that, you know, people in social sciences are better able to pursue, or, you know, people in technical genres, they are able to pursue higher studies.
Right.
I was like, I'm a dentist, then I did some public health, public policy, main kaha? And then, you know, he was like, have you heard of, and then I remember I mentioned, so that's another thing. I used to always observe people around.
Okay.
And I was never egoistic about accepting and seeing how people are making a difference in their lives. And, you know, so I remember just yesterday my brother I was like, अच्छा इसके बारे में बताओ. And Khan was like, तुम्हें क्या फर्क पड़ता है? तो मैंने कहा, no, I just want to know how people, you know, strive and, you know, fail and then attempt and then make it big.
Right.
So I remember there was this another friend of mine, and I was like, जैसे उसने GMAT दिया, that's for an MBA, I'm not an MBA. And then he was like, have you heard about GRE? And I was like, yeah, you know, and then he was like, no, it's not that difficult. Just give your GRE. It's very similar to CSAT.
Right.
And and you just apply to all the colleges. I was like, ऐसे थोड़ी ना होता है. इतना, you know, उसमें there must be so many different things to do. And this was 27th or 28th of August, and that was the day. And he was like, कि नहीं, you just give GRE, and it's English and maths, very close to CSAT. And I just thought, okay, I have 10 days. At least I'll not have that regret.
Right.
And so I think in terms of butterfly effect, I feel the only way I was wise was I always listen to advice, whether it's by a guru, whether it's by my mother. I tend to listen to people, like, or at least I know whom to listen to, and then I follow. You know, there are people who think that, okay, listen to your heart,
right,
know what you're doing. I always think that, you know, who am I? Like, you know,
sometimes there can be a lot of advice though. Like there can be too much advice around you.
That's true.
So you need to be sure of exactly who to take advice from.
Yeah, so I think in that sense, I'd already dealt with that karma of listening to too many people. Yeah. Right. But this time it paid off.
Yeah.
You know,
this time you were listening to the right people.
Yeah. And I was like, अच्छा ठीक है, दे देते हैं. And I remember 5th September. I was like, 3rd September is my birthday. Chill करूँगी. 5th को दे दूँगी GRE. And I just, you know, in a week's time, I remember looking at all of those GRE books, and I think I was smart. I knew that algebra I did not know. And that is probably where a lot of my childhood reading came into picture, because a lot of it was English, and I realized that a lot of random IQ tests that I would give, or a lot of random analytical tests or quizzes, or I don't know, those kinds of weird things I would do on web, now paid off, you know, because it was all a timed online test, and it was probably the first online test, and I got a great GRE score, and I was shocked. Yeah. I was like, okay, like out of 340, it was some 325. I was like, okay, so that's great. Yeah. Okay. And then I was like, okay, let's apply. And then I remember this friend of mine who had inspired me to give GRE. He was like, कि तुम एक काम करो, type 2 colleges में apply कर दो, do not apply to Ivy Leagues. Because, you know, if you apply to an Ivy League, obviously you're not getting through. And then
he was very sure.
He was very sure that I was not getting through, and he's like, rejection आ जाएगा एक बार तो कभी नहीं हो पाएगा. So he was like, don't do that. Let's play safe and, you know, apply to state universities, and, you know, then take it from there. And I was like, क्या फर्क पड़ रहा है? Because for me it was such a long shot.
Yeah.
I was like, कुछ नहीं तो UPSC में मेरा confidence बढ़ जाएगा कि GRE में इतना है. I was still thinking UPSC was an end that I was going towards. I was like, you know, forget it. Let's just apply to all colleges. Doesn't matter. And I remember that in all my college applications, I literally wrote what my life was all about. You know, starting with social work, not knowing where to go, ending up in dentistry.
So in a way, you're writing your SOP right now.
Exactly. So I'm telling you what I wrote in my SOP. Yeah. And then I remember that UPSC never happened.
Yeah.
And I did not, clear my mains.
Right.
And Harvard happened. And I was like, okay.
Not a bad plan B.
Not a bad plan B. And so I was 25 at that time. So it was good. I was like, okay, a long shot, that 1 week which I've described in the last 10 minutes, literally saved me and probably brought me back to where I started,
right.
So I think this phenomenon is, this pattern in my life, I think is quite prevalent, that I end up coming back to where I started.
True.
So, starting from the Motiabind camps and then going back to, say documenting the role that frontline workers or Anganwadi workers play. I think it's sort of come back, and so goes with my personal life. Marrying my best friend, whom I knew since forever. Since school
After
time.
taking a long journey.
Journey. So I think, so I'm at that point in my life where I feel that, okay, if there are things that I feel so sincerely about, and not just for me, I would say that to whoever is listening to this, my learning has been that, yes, it's pretty much like The Alchemist also, right? You go around and then you realize you come back to where you started.
So, interesting enough, so the person you married, you were always friends with him, right? Growing up and even when you were young. What made you eventually see that this was the right person? I'm sure you were not dating that person before, otherwise it would have happened earlier.
Yeah. So
what I'm trying to ask is, what made you see friendship as partnership?
Right. I think the answer is in your question. The moment I realized that, okay, let's just look back at life.
Right.
Keshav has forever been there with me through all of these things that I just talked about.
Right.
And this is just professional, right?
Yeah.
There are so many more aspects to life. There is, of course, a personal aspect. There's a spiritual journey. And I think that the point where I realized this was, when I started working for the Harvard India Research Center, when things became more settled.
Right.
And I just looked back at my life and I was like, okay, where did I start? I started at 18 and now I'm 28. And for the past 10 years of my life, I realized that Keshav has been my partner already. It's just that now I will be giving it a name.
Right.
So, and I realized that he has so naturally and organically been part of who I am, and I've been part of who he is.
Right.
That it's only for the sake of giving it a name, and of course society's function on very, very institutionalized relationships, and marriage is of course a very important institution. So I think the point. So for me, it was again coming back to where I started. I realized that this is not. Not something I'm entering into or doing. This is something that I was always within.
So interesting you should mention that. One of the conflicts that people have, especially in their late 20s, early 30s, is people want to marry their aspirations. People have a lot of expectations from people who they want to marry, a certain set of criteria people have. So I think this is something, this is what I liked about, this is what I was happy about when you told me that Keshav was going to be the one. That you chose love in your friendship, or you saw that love existed already in your friendship.
Yeah, I think it's very important to make a distinction between marrying your aspirations, which is a very transactional way of looking at things,
right,
as opposed to marrying someone who makes you be more of yourself. Because and especially with the social media age, and probably that's how communication works right now, right? If you meet somebody anonymous on the social media, you're all looking at your list.
Right.
Ki, acha, isme check. Okay, now I think I'm ready to talk to this person. And then when you talk, okay, isme check. Okay, I'm ready to like this person. Okay, now I'm ready to love this person. And then this checklist for marriage. And when any of those checks do not match, suppose you end up getting married to that person, you're back to square one.
Right.
So it's not food you're ordering on Zomato, right? It's not filters you're applying.
True.
कि max safety भी हो, 40% off भी हो, and तुम्हारे taste का भी हो, deliver भी करता हो, and contactless delivery भी हो. So I think A very simple solution or a litmus test would be to choose the person who brings out the best in yourself. And that's not just, from my perspective, from that other person's perspective. Like whether you bring out the best in that person, and whether it be your friend. I mean, usually in friendships it's easier because, friendships by nature are more selfless. Less transactional. So I mean, and we were friends. So but otherwise, even say romantic relationships which end up into something like that, I think whoever brings out the best and not the worst in you should be the person. And so there may be people who may be taking your aspirations but bring out the worst in you. I would ask you to stay away from it, because that would never give you the peace of mind and never make you happy.
Yeah, I think contactless delivery is something I'm not looking for at all. But I think interesting that you mentioned about social media. What social media does is that it sort of hazes things out for you in a way that you're always looking for criteria. But additionally to that, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of, if you're looking for, let's say, dating, there are a lot of people out there. So you constantly are, sort of having too many faces to choose from. But it does, like, not just talking about dating, about life in general. Social media has done this to almost all aspects of our lives, right? What it's done is that it's given us so much choice, so much information from so many sources, that you don't really know what to trust, who to trust, right? For example, in this pandemic, if you ask people, it is more likely that they would be believing in some sort of conspiracy theory about the pandemic than actual information, scientific information. We've seen the president of the US give out conflicting information in his press conferences. I think, so do you see, whether it is in public health, or for information in general, do you think the social media has sort of made it more difficult for us to seek information or function as a society in general?
Right. I also had anthropology as my subject in UPSC. So that's the framing that I would give.
See, UPSC trains you for everything, even before you get in, right? Anyway.
Even without getting in.
Absolutely, you know so much
Not
already.
Before, without getting in. So I would say that communication obviously always existed in different forms. Throughout human existence. People learned how to write. There was this phase of letters. I mean, I'm sure our parents have written letters to each other. There was post and mail. And then there were newspapers, right? So for a large part of the past century, newspapers dominated your source of public information. And of course, these are all a handful of newspapers, usually run by a handful of people, right? And that is all the information you were exposed to. And this is much before the globalization era, right? So I think जो कहते हैं दायरा बढ़ गया है information का, right? 200-300 years back, so there is always this classical and the folk distinction between how people consume information, whether it's in the West or in the East. There is always this classical literature, which was always in control of the ruling classes, and then there is this folk tradition, which is usually not written, but mostly oral and transferred songs, dances, folklores,
folklores,
so I'm trying to say that gossiping and conspiracy theories have always been part of human discourse, and of course that was more verbal or was written. And then we come to a newspaper era where narratives or information is decided or determined by, say, top 5 dailies and their top editors. We've lived through that era. And then with the coming of 90s and with the coming of the internet age, from where I see it, I really think that social media has democratized information. I mean, my basic understanding is, yes, of course, every tool, every medium comes with its positives and negatives, and I'll come to that. In fact, I have greater concerns regarding social media, not just the way misinformation is spreading on social media, but concerns related to data privacy. So I'll come to that. But in terms of what it has allowed for is that until a couple of years ago, if you wanted to know something about your history,
right,
or something else, there were only a certain number of limited textbooks that you could go to, or op-eds written by a handful of people, and then that was the truth that you were reading. But social media has allowed you to dig through a variety of content which is being put out by a variety of people. Right now, the narrative or the discourse is not dominated or cannot be dominated by a handful of people. So in that sense, it's more democratizing, because you cannot dictate what content people read and what content people don't read. So I think in that way it's been revolutionary, because now any common person can choose not to read or not to go by an op-ed that has been written by a major daily figure, and just go ahead and follow somebody on a YouTube channel, a nobody until now. I mean, there are so many nobodies who are becoming stars. So I think from an elitist perspective, it's very easy to dismiss such new YouTubers or such new messengers as people who are spreading fake information. I think that's a very of course, fake information is out there. And I won't be very surprised if a lot of leading journalists or historians have introduced a lot of their own perspective and sold that as the truth. So that always happens, and we'll come to that.
I think that can happen more when the information is controlled by a handful.
Exactly.
I'm not saying for the right or wrong, but human biases can occur. Like, they are more obvious to occur than not. So if a very few people control information, on whether it's on subject or information in general broadcasting, then their biases would sort of direct what the narrative will be of the entire country. But here people are getting to choose from, obviously people make choices, people choose from other people who are sort of conforming to their own established points of view, but still they have the choice of hearing someone else.
And that is particularly very important as we consume information as with regards to international relations, history, because it's so much about perspective over there. And that's where I would like to draw a line between scientific studies, where accurate scientific information is what it is. There cannot be a perspective to it. For example, if global warming is a fact, it's a fact. It doesn't matter whether you want to accept it or whether there's a different spin to it, whether there's a perspective to it. It's a truth. But as with regards to international diplomacy, as with regards to history, as with regards to even sociology, I think different perspectives are equally important, as much as the facts stand. But the way you narrate those facts makes a world of a difference. And I think politics feeds from all of these streams. So which is why politically social media platforms have become so much more important now, for good or for bad. The good part is that really that you cannot stop someone from knowing something if you want them to know something. The information is all out there. People have greater choices. And I would say that, and which is a phenomenon not just in India but world over, that established perspectives, established literary circles are being questioned for the first time because of
it's
social
happening
media.
For the first time.
And I think that's a good thing. Because for the first time, established narratives are being questioned. Established biases are being questioned. So it's important to question that. And I'm a liberal, and I think the founding philosophy of being a liberal is to allow for more discourse.
Absolutely.
And if you allow for more discourse, you cannot really dismiss everything as fake and misinformation. At times you have to understand which side of the line you are. If you do not come from an established, say for example in Delhi, from a particular, as the term goes around, this particular Lutyens media circle, and if you are this independent media guy who just picks up a camera, has a YouTube channel, I think they have a right to question all the big media houses.
Absolutely.
So in that way it is good. But the bad part as far as social media is concerned is that it is open for a lot of manipulation.
Yeah.
And that is something we do not realize.
Yeah.
Not very many people realize that. And whether I think manipulation by political leaders always existed.
Yeah, that's sort of their job.
Yeah.
That is something they have to do.
Yeah, I mean, they have to sell a story, right? They have to sell a dream.
Yeah.
And I think that's what leadership does.
Yeah.
It gives you a dream and tells you that I will lead you to that dream.
Yeah,
and that's how society.
Everybody does it.
Yeah. So I don't think that politicians are at any particular advantage, because my personal opinion is that there were times 500, 600 years ago where people did not know anything about what the leader
universe
stands for, and okay, अब वो राजा आ गया, अब वो जीत गए, अब वो राजा बन गए.
It was not a democracy. Whoever kills the other person gets to rule, right?
So these things were not questioned, and if they gave an idea, people were more. In fact, back then, people were more normative, and people were more willing to take the least path of resistance and just accept what is being thrown at them.
True.
So I really don't think political leaders are at any better advantage as much as being at a disadvantage, because now everybody can be questioned.
I think in politics it's been the first mover's advantage. Then when social media came, whoever got good with it initially, you can see it on both sides, right? It's not a Congress versus BJP or any other party argument. Even within Congress, for example, we usually see that Congress was the party that sort of was a laggard in adopting social media. But even within that party, there are leaders. Shashi Tharoor is an example who's sort of adopted early and has a huge following. He knows how to use it and he does it better than other people. So I think it was more of that than politicians having a specific advantage.
Yeah.
Obviously, they have a larger, audience available to them on important issues. Yeah. But then that's true for every politician.
And then the disadvantage is whether it be the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of India.
Yeah.
If he tweets something,
it's reputation, right?
Nothing disallows a commoner.
Yeah.
From
tweeting, hey, you are bullshitting me.
Exactly.
Right.
Nobody stops that.
Exactly.
Now, that was not possible 300 years ago, where there was a king sitting there, there is a Diwan-e-Aam.
Not even 15 years ago.
There is a Diwan-e-Khas.
Right.
And then there are so many norms involved, and then you have to, bow down 10 times before being able to say something.
Raja ki taraf apni peet karke bhi nahi ja sakte.
Exactly.
Right? All those things.
So that way, world has become flatter.
Yeah. I think the biggest or the most prominent, not disadvantage, but the negative impact I see that social media has done, and it has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with the inability of people to have actual conversations, because people get pushed into extremes, either left or right or whatever extreme, whatever you're discussing, and then there's very less scope for actual conversation to move ahead,
right?
To actually dig deep into issues, explore it, because people do tag each other in terms of, oh, you belong to that group, you belong to that group, we are not talking, oh, you are like they label each other, or you're racist or you're whatever,
right?
And we will not talk because you are so and so. But it doesn't matter, right? If you want to move the conversation forward, you need to first have that conversation,
right? Yeah, I think that's to do with two things. One, the nature of the platform itself,
right?
It's I don't know how many character tweet, right? It's not 1,000 lines that you can write. Everybody has small segments of attention,
right?
So things are increasingly moving towards being very, very binary. Now let's step back. There was always an established narrative, right? And then there is this huge deluge of people who start questioning this narrative. And especially let's take the example of India,
right?
In India, of course, the so-called, I'll call this so-called because I really do not believe in left or right.
Those are very fluid.
I don't know what
Changes
that
with time.
means.
Yeah, yeah.
And I don't think it's like a category like not applicable, like, right? If the world has to move forward, and if it has to evolve, then we can't evolve by being a left or by being a right. So but I think what has happened is, then especially in India, the left discourse was obviously the dominant discourse, the so-called again. And then with the coming of social media, coming of a different government, which had of course Congress was the majority party for almost all of India's life until the Modi government came in. So I think there are 2 to 3 nuances which I feel have played out. One is that suddenly people are like, okay, there are these right wingers, and then first thing which I feel is stereotyping is as old as us eating food and going to sleep. Stereotyping is part of, we should know our limitations as well.
It's very tribal in nature. It's a tribal instinct.
Exactly.
That stereotypes
so
people.
Stereotyping always existed, and social media allows you to stereotype very easily.
Right.
For example, hashtags. What are hashtags? They are labeling things,
labels,
right?
exactly.
Acha, you are a bhakt, you are a pseudo liberal,
exactly,
all these,
and that's where the debate ends,
and that's it. So ठीक है, तो मतलब okay, you are on the other side and
so
things
let's
are
not
becoming
talk.
binary. तो point ही क्या है
Exactly.
बात करने का, right? So social media, the issue is also because a post can only be as long.
True.
A counter comment can only be as long. A tweet can only be as long. Hence, there is no scope for a more nuanced discussion.
Absolutely.
And that's where I feel that as opposed to Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram is about a picture saying like whatever it wants to say. That's
a picture. They used to say a picture speaks 1,000 words, but right now it's not speaking anything. It's just a picture followed by by more pictures, and you get nothing out of it.
And I feel that this is where platforms like YouTube actually allow for more conversations to take place. Because unless there's a nuanced conversation, you cannot come to a middle ground. So and then there is this other aspect which I would want to highlight, that there's also a class issue when it comes to left and right in India.
How so?
I feel that there is this mindset that there is only, and especially with the so-called left, that that this is an elitist mindset, that anybody who's questioning established narratives, even on some aspects, and that person may not be very, very politically active, is branded as bhakt, is branded as right-winger, gawar, because they are assumed to be tier 2, tier 3 people who cannot speak better English than them, and who put out all those Facebook posts, who are assumed to be extremists, assumed to be sort of stupid, assumed to be falling prey to misinformation. What seems misinformation to them may probably be a different perspective that they are bringing in.
Sometimes even if it is, let's say, misinformation, it's not their fault that they've got it. If good information was your job, whoever the liberal elite is or whoever the information elite is, you did not do a good job.
I would not say so. I'm I am trying to highlight something else. I follow Advaita philosophy. It anyway says world is an illusion. Right? So you come from that starting point, that people come from different perspectives, different contexts, and different frames of viewing something. True. So something, of course, now again, this is where science is important, and we need to delineate between opinions and science. So for example, something like the world, global warming is a fact, or COVID-19 ke liye you have to wear a mask. This is pure hard science. Here the question of misinformation, disinformation comes in. And then of course there is the role of, say, for example, public health practitioners like us. What have we done to put out public health information out there? But for things more nuanced, in terms of perspectives, in terms of history, in terms of what we think of as a society, in terms of international relations, diplomacy, there I would say that what sounds misinformation to you might be their side of the story, or might be their perspective. So that's coming. So that's one. The reverse is also true. The so-called right wing is so impatient and restless, and they're like that for all these years a particular narrative has dominated the discourse, and now is our time. And in that impatience, they tend to drive the conversation to a very, very black and white, to a very, very binary. Ki, acha, if you do this, then you are that. If you don't do this, then you're not a nationalist. That's not how things work. And especially if the right wing, so-called right wing, is trying to change the narrative, they'll have to understand that it all comes with discourse,
right?
And if you want to influence the society, then you influence them with thought.
True.
So what they are doing to you, what left is doing to you, you cannot be labeling the left and outcasting them.
Right.
So it's to do with just the way both.
I do feel if you have to have a conversation with society in general, you need to be talking to everybody, left or right.
Exactly.
And no matter which side you yourself come from. That is how the conversation moves forward. Like, first talk to people.
Yeah. And another villain in this conversation is, one is of course our own biases, and people would like to, होता नहीं है गाँव मोहल्ले में वो अंकल उन्हीं के साथ बैठ के बात करेंगे, who conform to those views, right? That's just human nature.
True.
But another villain which I am more worried about is that are all of these social media corporations and their need to advertise through social media platforms.
Yeah.
And obviously, if they want to advertise stuff to you, it's an open secret now that all of your social media feeds are based on, what is it that you want to see more of.
True.
Increasingly, your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed will show you content from people who are more likely to conform to your views. And that's just because of this larger game around advertising.
Exactly. It's what I call the algorithm trap, right? It keeps you showing what you already see. Exactly. And you become an extreme person because for 5-6 years, you have been seeing the exact same type of content. And you're not exposed to the other side or whatever is the other perspective. So you'll become an extreme person. If I believe in A and for 5 years I've been just seeing versions of A without realizing there's a B, then I will be a very extreme person. And that's what it is doing.
Yes, and I really think, and as you mentioned, algorithms, machine learning, right? A machine is trying to learn your behavior.
Absolutely.
What is Ananya more likely to eat today? What is Ananya more likely to read today? Tomorrow, I will only be given suggestions of what I'm more likely to eat or what I'm more likely to read. So this is a trap where I think it's far beyond politicians, far beyond journalists. It has to do something with people sitting in the Silicon Valley.
Absolutely. So, I couldn't agree more.
So and for that, and I think there are so many laws which exist for absolutely every goddamn thing in the world, right?
Yeah.
Especially India is a nice legal jungle.
Right.
But there are no laws which exist as far as data privacy on social media platforms is concerned. And that can only happen if more and more people are aware of the way their information is being used. It's not like people are selling your data to some. Fine, some may be doing that, but it's just the way that nudges and the way behavioral science is being tapped into by machine learning in all of these social media platforms, that you end up seeing what you're more like, and you end up becoming more like what you want to be. And then you go out and step into the world and realize, there are so many other people who have so many other views and so many other perspectives, and then you are confused. So I think that's a trap that we have to watch out for. And a starting point for that is being aware that this trap exists. And having a public opinion against it, and making these corporations be more accountable. Because I really don't. I think 99% Indians do not.
No, I don't think people realize it.
I mean, I won't say it's an overstatement. 99%.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with it, because people don't realize it, that this is happening to them. That they are being transformed into an extreme version of themselves.
Right.
Like, I see it in my house, I see it in my family, I see it among my friends, I see it in like random people online who I text with online or who argue with me online on things which are not even polarizing topics. Some things that I post are not political, but since people come from a political leaning or a right left leaning, they always bring that point of view in that. Some things are very factual, very objective, and I think objectivity is something which is sacred to moving forward for any society. Like the whole Renaissance happened when the whole Renaissance was a battle for objectivity, right? People said we want scientific truth, or there should be some common truths for everybody, and that's how society moved forward. And that is something which social media is attacking in the biggest way, and that is what I feel is the negative consequence.
Attacking, and I would say again, I'll come back to the drawing board, that social media is democratizing narratives and is democratizing opinions. If social media did not exist, I don't think I would have been able to air this opinion of mine.
No, I agree. So I agree with the democrat.
And I'm coming to that in terms of common truths. Of course, there has to be a common agenda for the world. For example, I mean, from a public health perspective, I think UN Sustainable Development Goals. There has to be some sort of an international truth that exists, which is based on objectivity, which is based on science.
Like climate change, for example, also.
Exactly. And obviously society cannot, and society will not move forward unless that level of objectivity is there. But a parallel movement that I have perceived is that until late 90s, the narrative was, of course, controlled by a handful of people in each of the countries. And a handful of democracies, so to speak.
There
was a time when Hollywood really dictated what people wore, what people spoke about, what was considered to be cool. I mean, I'll give a very blunt example that I remember a movie of Arnold Schwarzenegger or something where he would go around killing 100 natives to protect one American life. And this is the kind of crap that we've been fed with.
Exactly.
Right? So,
I mean, some countries will always be more powerful than others, so we can't change that.
Probably human, animal nature, just the nature of life. But I think in that sense, especially, with the Facebook, all of that, with the Arab Revolution, I think that idea of self-determination, thinking for yourself, was an anti-globalization reaction. But in some ways it was good. And of course, the extreme reaction is that people pick up things from the internet, and then, of course, terrorism. Terrorism has been one of the biggest benefactors of internet and social media. So we cannot discount that fact. But I feel social media is just the new age communication platforms. It's not like people are not killing each other. In fact, more laws and more accountability exists today.
I mean, despite everything, we are actually going through the most peaceful period in humanity.
Exactly.
The incidence of war and death due to conflict is the lowest right now.
If you scientifically see that, there were more wars, there were more war crimes before the age of social media. Now what has happened is background conversations or bedroom conversations are out there on your face. And obviously it's awkward, and obviously you're like, इसमें left right wing कहाँ आ गया भाई? Like, why are people fighting over it? So for example, a recent example in India is Kangana Ranaut tweets something. I didn't even know she had a Twitter account, okay? until her building was demolished. And I was like, okay, like I wouldn't have followed her on Twitter. And then there is a COVID-19 pandemic going on, right? There is an economic crisis going on, and then I come to know, and I've lived in Mumbai, and then I come to know that BMC just comes just because of something she's tweeted or said, comes and suddenly one day realizes कि आपका घर गलत बना है, and let's demolish it. So that's scary. And because I have a place in Mumbai, and I was like, okay, so if I tweet or say something today on this show, would they go and demolish my building?
You can try.
I can try. So and especially आजकल news channels में भी there is so much of attention to who said what.
It's like a big gossip platform.
It is like, if you look at कोई भी any news channel, उन्होंने उनको ये कह दिया, Twitter पे ये war हो गई. अच्छा, until the time it's restricted to Twitter, it's fine. I can shut Twitter and switch off my phone. But when I see real time repercussions कि Twitter war से जो है सरकारें बन रही हैं, गिर रही हैं. So I wonder, is that the new reality?
I think as a society we are getting used to social media because it's new to us, and I think this phase of hyper reactivity is going to pass. And actual conversations will take over, and society will learn to deal with all of this.
And I think people are coming to realize that.
This is one such effort where we are trying to have actual conversation in person, one-on-one, rather than have a Twitter feud. So Ananya, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
This was a pleasure talking to you. We talked about so much.
I know.
And I've known you for so many years, and one thing I really like about you is that despite what your beliefs are or how different they are from the other person, you are always happy to have a conversation. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Anshuman. Hey, Anshuman.